Thanks again, everyone, for coming. This is our first symposium and workshop. It's only a short symposium because we don't want to have you on Zoom all day. Everyone has already, especially for the UK, everyone's been on Zoom all day. We don't want to keep you for too long. My name is Katie Straker, and I work with MusicID, but I'm also a musicologist. I'm a PhD student at the Graduate Center. I first came to MusicID a little over 2 years ago, just as a graduate student, because I was using some chart research in my record charts in my research, and I just needed a better source for them. And I found that with MusicID, I was able to do in minutes what was taking me hours to do through publisher websites, random online archives, trade magazine scans, and so on. So I wanted to start this event to help people understand a little bit more about how they can use the data and also just how to use the system to use it for their own goals. So while I may be on the payroll now, all of my promotion and wanting to help scholars use it comes from a place of total sincerity as a scholar, which again for me is in musicology. So I always have that eye in using it. And today I wanted to bring in some people from other fields to help them, to help all of you understand some of the different ways that you can use it. It's not just limited to popular music studies or music industry courses, economics, things like that. It really has a lot of diverse applications. So some of you may be familiar with MusicID, but many of you may not. So let me tell you just a little bit about the platform, since it's the center of focus here today. And I'll go over that in more detail later in the workshop. But for those of you who aren't familiar, MusicID is an unparalleled tool for digital humanities, where we archive 70 years of record charts from 74 countries. Let me change my tab. We have 70 years of record charts from 74 countries, and we also provide revenue calculations for the top 1,000 artists, songs, and albums of each year since the year 2000. We have 3 modules, which you can see here, which are MusicID Data, Revenue, and Impact. Data is the core of the system. That's our searchable archive, which provides complete results for artists and records in the charts since 1950 and displays all of their chart histories or individual chart days in a text table and creates automated graphs of the chart histories, which you'll see later. Actually, no, I can show you now. Here we go. This is an example of some of the graphs. You can see the table down there in the corner. And of course, we'll see all of this in larger detail. Our other modules, Impact and Revenue, are created by mathematician Steve Houghton, who uses chart data along with AFPI data to create worldwide rankings of artists, songs, and albums, which is Impact. So Impact is just these kind of text lists of rankings and the source information. And Revenue is a calculation of how much a particular song, artist, or album earned since the year 2000, so for the 21st century. Just to warn you, I have a tendency to say of all time, but when I say of all time, I mean all of the 21st century. So in all of these cases, except for Impact, so revenue and data, the graph, the source data can easily be exported to spreadsheets, or these graphs that you're looking at here can be exported as images for use in your records, for your own computational analysis, or for use in presentations. And I'll leave our contact information up while I wrap up the introduction. So over the last 2 years of working with MusicID, I've learned several things. First of all, that there are a lot more practical uses for record chart data than I ever had imagined. Second, that most people like me have no idea what those uses are until you actually sit down and try to work with it. And third, that like me, also most people don't even know about the existence of the platform, even if the university subscribes to it, which mine does, but I never knew. So as I wrote about in the announcement for the event, which you may have read on the Eventbrite page, we really are truly privileged to meet so many wonderful and emerging and senior scholars every week as we meet students and professors all over the world, and we hear about their ongoing work. Some of it using MusicID, some of it completely unrelated. And I've been very eager to just see their work out in the world and see where it goes. So we thought, why not just create an opportunity to do that? So for our first venture, I was also wanting to have a workshop to just help the awareness with scholars so that you can learn what the resource is and how you can use it in your research. So to that end, we've combined this with a couple of presentations just to fill an hour to give you an idea of how people are actually using record chart data from MusicID and from other sources in their actual work. So since everything takes 4 times longer virtually, I didn't want to keep you all for a great big conference. So this is successful. Maybe it can become a series and we'll have an hour of presentations, maybe once a quarter. But to start things off, we'll have a presentation from Andrew Ullah, who's presenting Deconstructing the Billboard Hot 100. And then next, Matt Flynn from the University of Liverpool will be presenting his work in developing a pedagogy for data and music industry courses. If time permits at the end, I'll give a very short and informal presentation about some of the ways that I have been able to use MusicID and record charts in general and musicology as a tool of insight, instead of simply as a items of empirical data to use for support and for arguments. So just let me go over the ground rules before I hand things over to Andrew. He'll give a presentation for 15 minutes, and after that, we'll have 5 minutes for Q&A. If at any time you have any questions for us, problems, please put that into the chat. And I or my administrator, Paul, here will be able to take care of that and answer your questions. And thanks again to Paul for helping us run this, because I could not do this without you. He's been very helpful in getting it all set up. And if you have a question for our presenter in the Q&A, please put that into the Q&A tab, and we will be able to answer that during the Q&A session. After the hour is up, we will transition to the workshop. So I'll give you just a short break to log into the system, get settled, and I'll go over more of that at the top of the hour. So without further ado, let me stop sharing and allow Andrew to rejoin us. All right, great. So I'll hand it over to Andrew, and he will tell you a little bit about himself.
Thank you so much, Katie. It's been a pleasure working with you over the past few months. And for the lovely introduction, my name is Andrew. I'm a current MBA student at the University of Southern California, Marshall School of Business. I'm also a royalty consultant where I help artists collect all the value that is due to them. And today I'm going to be covering a data science project that I did last fall on trying to predict the likelihood of a song ending up on Billboard Hot 100. And Billboard is a way to measure a song's success from a sales perspective. So without further ado, I'm going to start sharing my presentation. Please let me know if you can see my screen. So a little bit of context about how this project came to be. I was originally going to do credit card analysis with my group, but I've always been interested in music cognition, which is breaking down music into more of a science. But the challenge here was to find data that actually was usable. So my team said, if you can find reliable data, then we can do this project. So I went about trying to figure out where I was going to pull these specific data sources. And I found MusicID's revenue, specifically that module, was very helpful for this project because it allowed us to see some type of insight into how much a song would earn if it ended up on Billboard. And the next set was Spotify, which allowed us to see songs in their compositional element form, so which I'm going to get into a little bit further. And the business problem that we were trying to solve, a little bit of context in the music industry, the models are changing within record labels and how they allocate their capital. So historically, artists would sign a record deal, which would be an 80-20 record label to artist favor. Now that is completely flipped because artists are bringing their marketing resources to the record labels. So the model has significantly changed. The second point being the royalty payout models. Listen to a song for 30 seconds now, that counts as a unit of sale. So for those specific two reasons, the nature of the song structures are changing. And I wanted to provide some type of an insight using data science to know what songs were going to be successful from a commercial standpoint. And so the scope of the project really does pertain to Billboard, but the way that we're assessing that is from MusicID and from Spotify. Here are examples of the MusicID data set, as well as combining it via the ISRC code, which is the unique identifier from Spotify, from the industry standard of sound recordings. So we're joining the data together. We know the compositional elements of the song and also how much the song has earned. And the agenda for today, I just cover the problem matrix, a little bit of background about how this project came to be, an influence chart, analysis, some models that I'm going to present, and KPIs and improvements, and my insights and recommendations. So our analysis variables were X's, where we're pulling from the data from Spotify, acousticness, whether a track is explicit, liveliness, what is the time signature, is it instrumental, how danceable is it speechy, valence, popularity, all of these things considered to try and see if we can model what is our Y variable, which is a song ending up, or the elements of a song that would typically end up on the Billboard Hot 100. And this essentially is some histograms that show the frequency of the songs that end up on Billboard. So as we can see, Spotify's open API saying that most of the songs are highly concentrated within being acoustic, the danceability, duration, loudness, the tempo. We're really just trying to see what is the greatest concentration of a certain attribute that is a song that ends up on Billboard's Hot 100. And here are the tables associated with our regression model. Decision tree is further breaking down, clustering songs or attributes of those songs that are most present in Billboard's Hot 100. Our KPIs. And this was a little disappointing within my project because I expected something. More context about me, I'm a classical musician. So I was expecting to see something in particular jump out at me, like acousticness, for example, the duration, but everything was pretty moderate. But the one thing that did stick out was that year over year, especially within the past 3 years, we're seeing songs getting shorter and shorter. And that's no surprise, but I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit deeper, pulling specifically 2 use cases, Lil Nas X, Old Town Road, and Ian Dior 24 Karat Gold. Those songs were individually just over 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 17 seconds and 2 minutes and 34 seconds. And this makes sense because both of them originated on TikTok. And as I mentioned prior, the royalty payout model of streaming platforms is 30 seconds. So it's not economically beneficial for songs to be any longer than 30 seconds. You're still going to get a unit of sale. So we're seeing songs getting shorter. Our attention spans are also getting shorter. So that is, it does make sense that those two go together. And the specific use case that I want to highlight is Saweetie's Tap In, which is 2 minutes and 19 seconds long. It's one of my favorite songs ever. And based on the estimates that we're able to pull using MusicID's data, we're forecasting that it's $860,000 of revenue that the song likely had generated. And it features it's not only a very shortened duration, but also features a lot of samples and a lot of featured artists at the front end of the song. So your attention at least stays for 30 seconds. Analysis improvements are to increase the sample size, to identify, maybe group things into genre, filter down the data to the past 3 years, shorter data sets. What's cool about this is that we're having more and more data within music today. So we can say that to predict the likelihood, shorten the window of time that we're using to analyze the data with. And secondly, another recommendation is to pull data or songs that specifically originated on TikTok, on platforms like Snapchat, on Facebook, to really see what if there are differences between the song structures that pertain to these individual platforms of consumption. And thank you very much for attending my presentation. I will open up now for the Q&A.
Okay, I will rejoin just to help moderate the Q&A. Thanks for that, Andrew. Sorry, you came in well under time, so I'll probably have time to talk later. And I'm not going to be happy you make me talk. So thanks a lot for this presentation again. I love this presentation as a musicologist because even though you're coming from a music business point of view, to look at recommendations for how to recommendations for artists and for labels to help them find out how they can just have a hit and be successful. There are so many other little interesting things nested in it, like what kind of traits are common in songs, how the format and how the royalty payouts are affecting the duration, and also some of the songwriting attributes themselves. So there's a lot there, like I'm excited about this because there's a lot of ground for future exploration for you or for anyone who wants to pick up where you left off. Let's see. Okay, so our first question is someone is asking, what conclusions did you reach?
The conclusions that I reached were to narrow down the songs on specific platforms. So if a song was popular on TikTok, really benchmark that against other songs that are charting from, that are originating from TikTok, and see if there are, just get more granular with your analysis, is what I can say. So do not look at, I mean, there is certain things that are common historically, but there are other nuances that are happening within the past couple of years that I think are very interesting that we need to isolate and kind of treat more on an individual basis.
Great, thanks. Another person has asked if there were any ethnomusicologists or musicologists in your team.
No, so I'm a classical musician, and there were no musicologists on my team. So I'm an MBA student. My colleagues on this project were data scientists, like engineering product background. So I was really the one with the technical musical background, not an ethnomusicologist or musicology, but just a classical musician. My team loved music. My team loves music. They obviously love music, but yeah, I was the only musician on the project. I wish I had a musicologist. So later on in the semester, like the following semester, I had Katie to really like bounce all these ideas off of. So I wish I had her on my project.
Okay, so yeah, so you were able to use your background as a classical musician to bring that into the analysis portion, and then I guess everyone else was able to help you with some of the with the data analysis and with the business ends.
Yeah, I brought in the industry expertise in terms of the royalties, the financial models. I was able to bring that in, but my team really did help out with the modeling. Aside from that, I did the decision tree, but the hard regression analysis, there was also principal component analysis that was done. All like the crazier models, my team had dove into those.
Okay, and Brigitte Johnson, who asked about if you have a musicologist, has a follow-up. I'll read off her comment and then you can respond to this however you'd like. So she says, strong song structures and form in mainstream pop has shifted a lot since the 90s. So individual musical elements may not be the best basis for analysis. For example, you see these elements in music going back to the mid 20th century when all songs were 2 minutes long due to technology.
Love that.
So I know you're not a musicologist, but do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, so song structure, I'm glad that you are bringing this. We were also looking into data for that exact reason. There's another source called Deconstructing. The name's blank on me, but essentially they're breaking down songs into the structures. So where's the chorus live? Where's the verse live? All of these things. And yes, the container, the technology format does really matter, but I wish I had more time to look into how these structures are changing. Like today, for example, a lot of the song's hooks and choruses are on the front end to hold your attention. That wasn't always like present with, but in like the 90s. So today, all the choruses are in the front to make sure that people are listening beyond 30 seconds. But I wish that I had ample amounts of data to show what is a song structure of like 5 million songs, so I could make those types of insights.
And just adding to that, since I've been working
Oh, there we
around
go.
on this
Yes,
a little
hit
bit.
songs deconstructed. Thank you, Morgan.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you, Brigida. She says, this is good stuff. Yeah, so like, even though you just had a small project, that's one of my points that I'll be making later about when you look at some of this data, it brings up a lot of opportunities for exploration. So the individual point that you find, such as songs are getting shorter or they're front loaded, and the cells maybe don't explain a lot, but they give you that realization so you can go on to explore it based on whatever your field of interest is. And so just thinking of, for example, of the mid-century songs, that's absolutely right that they were all short because of technology, radio, and because of the limitation in size on 45s, which is something I'll talk about very briefly later. So yeah, it would be really wonderful to see how some of the song attributes and song format compare just based on maybe how people reacted on the radio then. So that's what I love about your conclusion here, is that things are front loaded because of the royalty payout now, which would have been different 60, 70 years ago. So songs have always been short or longer, you know, it changes around decade to decade. And Andrew and I have talked about this a little bit too, because it's something that I'm really interested in. And but depending on the individual container and some of these legal issues, such as the royalty payout, it definitely has an effect on some of the song attributes, which is like, I'm sure someone else is working on this too, but I think there's so much music. There's a huge field for someone to dive into.
A little history lesson. I
Yeah.
recently, speaking of containers, Puccini wrote one of his operas, or arias, like maybe an opera section of it, with the intention to be put onto technology. I don't know if it was a gramophone or if it was a record or what, but he wrote it with the spirit of being put into a technology container.
Wow,
So,
I didn't know that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I found
that would
that
be
out.
very
I
early
wasn't
on.
aware, but it was recently, yeah.
Yeah, so very early on, was it something like, I can't remember the exact date, maybe someone can tell me. It was late 1890s-ish when Edison cylinders were becoming not super common because it was sort of cutting edge technology, but they were around. And there's one more question here,
yes,
which will probably be our last one before I move on to Matt. And she asks, did the team consider the role of 360 deals on how you analyze the royalty parts of today's artist contracts?
So we didn't consider that, but I can speak to 360. I don't think that I haven't seen them as often in recent years. I think that was record labels trying to mitigate their losses from digital disruption back in the mid 2000s. But now I'm seeing even more fragmentation in the market. So instead of consolidation under one, like a recording deal, publishing deal, touring, everything, it's all over the place. So even like independent artists are coming with their own like ecosystems into the record labels and demanding like those, 80% payouts, 20% record label, or even more favorable. So I haven't seen to date, ever since I've been working in the music industry for the past 6 years, a 360 deal.
Great, thanks so much everyone for these questions. I'll just read off this last comment and I'll hand things over to Matt. One last follow-up, Regina adds, like how TikTok takes the best parts of all the older songs, which were longer, and then they come back around like disco songs or the Oh No No sound, which was recorded in the girl group era. Yeah, taking all of these. I noticed that even in the early 2000s, so before, I couldn't answer why, but before we had downloads too much, people just started taking samples and putting them at the beginning of the track. So you're here on the radio and I'm like, oh yeah, I remember this 80s song. This is pretty cool. And then that's the hook they give you to keep listening, and that's it. They barely build on it.
Yeah, I think samples are a very interesting area for industry right now because it's moving so quick. There's a website right now called Who Sampled It, and a person on TikTok that points out what samples are being used in individual songs. But it's a good opportunity for older artists to, and I have to just cover, sampling covers both, like sound recording is a sample, but the music composition is called an interpolation. So usually what we're hearing is not a straight sample from the original sound recording, but interpolation from the composition into a new sound recording, which is tool for the original copyright owners, songwriters, or artists, because it allows them to negotiate what percentages of the derivative work is needed. And then a new royalty stream from the derivative work. But catching up with it is very, very difficult. Like, you know, it's crazy. But if it's done properly, it could be very beneficial for the original creator.
Well, great. Yeah, thanks for that explanation, because I don't know anything about that. But I'm glad you mentioned Who Sampled, because we've actually worked with them a little bit. We have our head publisher has some kind of a package. So if your university is looking into bundle deals, we can give you a deal on Who Sampled Pro. Okay. But for anyone who isn't familiar with it, Who Sampled is a really, really wonderful, basically it's kind of a crowdsourced archive of any references to other music. So it's not just samples like in dance music or hip hop. It also goes into classical music with quotations and things like that. So it's just a list of references. And I haven't dug into some of the classical stuff to see how thoroughly it goes, because I'm also a medievalist. So I'm curious to see if you have cantus firmus masses and things like that listed in Who Sampled. But I wonder if they go that far.
Samples there. They were it was more of an homage. It was different concepts. Like you could sample each other back then, and it would be like, oh, you're paying tribute, not actually paying.
Yeah, that's a big difference. So okay, well, thank you so much for all of that. That can be your next presentation for us, is royalties over the years.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, so I will hand things over to Matt now. Just a moment, bear with me here while I get back to my gallery so I can turn on his video. We'll say goodbye to Andrew. So next up we have Matt Flynn, who will be coming with a very different point of view. He has been using MusicID as a music industry lecturer to help teach his students about data and how to use data in the music industry. So he's going to tell us about some of his efforts to develop a pedagogy of that.
Hello, everyone. Yes, thanks for the introduction, Katie, and thanks for the invite to come and talk. My name is Mathew Flynn. I'm a lecturer in music industries at the University of Liverpool. Bear with me while I just get my slides sorted out. And I teach predominantly on the MA in Music Industry Studies here. So we've currently got 50 master's students on the course. It's made up of a series of modules that are sort of, have been developed in a sort of and evolved. The course has been running for 20 years now. So the course was originally developed right at the beginning of the dawn of the digital era in music. And I think it launched in 1999, the year that Spotify changed things. And then it's evolved over the time. It has sort of 7 core modules that looks at music industry broadly and theoretical approaches to it. A module called Audiences, which looks at live music and the sort of the marketing of live music to audiences, and a study in popular music module, which is basically the sort of dissertation proposal element of the program. And then in semester 2, it sort of narrows down its focus into a module called Contracts and Copyright, which is really the module I'm going to refer to today, and talking about the stuff that I've been trying to do with embedding data analysis in the curriculum. And we have music industry management, which looks at not just artist management, but different methods of management that are applied across the various aspects of the music industries. We have a specific module on Asian music markets in recognition of the sort of rise of, and the dominance of Japan in the sort of pre-2000s era, and then the rise of South Korea and more recently China as a global player on the international music stage. And then we have a module about globalization, which looks at all the other markets that are uncovered in sort of looking at USA and UK predominantly throughout as the sort of foundation of the course, and the Asian markets. And one of the things that I've noticed over the past few years, as I've been teaching copyright and contracts predominantly. The emergence of, and this alludes to what Andrew has just been talking about, this idea of songs changing as we move from a unit model to a use model as consumers, and the platform starting to drive how songs are structured and formatted, and particularly the length. I would certainly agree with Andrew's conclusions there. And then this idea of moving away even from what was the key driver, economic driver in the music industries through the latter half of the 20th century, which was the album, back to much more of a song economy and a song model. And this is a quote from Keith Joplin, who writes for a blog in the UK called Media. And he's basically advocating that some songs are mini industries in and of themselves. And this sets up an interesting sort of premise to explore at the beginning of a copyright and contracts model. I'm not entirely sure I completely agree with him, but it sort of is a good way to, as an in for students to start to then dig down into, okay, well, how is this economy structured and those types of things. And fundamentally underlying any economy of music, again, as Andrew's just alluded to in his presentation, is the two foundational copyrights: the copyright in the song or the musical work, and the copyright in the master sound recording. And obviously, what connects those two things is a copyright in what's called the mechanical, when the song is put on a sound recording. When very often now they don't use the original sound recording when they sample, they replay it and re-record it, so they only have to clear the copyright on the original composition, so they don't have to sort of pay rights holders for both copyrights. And so increasingly, the teaching of these fundamental principles that are the foundations of how the music industries function. So I always talk about 5 C's. We have creativity and collaboration, where musicians come together to form things, and each of those creative and collaborative decisions that they take at some point is formulated in terms of commercial, copyright and contractual consequences. Each of those creative and collaborative decisions has consequences further down the line for commerce, contract and copyright, if they're seeking to economize the music that they make. And in the last 12 months, we've seen huge moves in the industry by established publishers and new entrants into the market, companies like Hypnosis, buying up the back catalogues of some of our most famous songwriters, so famously Bob Dylan and Neil Young, but a whole host of other heritage, what we could term heritage acts and heritage writers, but also new writers who are working on the sort of hits that Andrew was analysing in his presentation. And so this idea of a song economy and song catalogues has become a really hot topic in terms of study. But once you get beyond the fundamentals, one of the things, and again, going back to what Andrew was talking about again, this idea now that artists are starting to own not just the copyright and the musical works and license them for shorter periods of time to publishers, but as Taylor Swift sort of exemplifies, but with platforms like SoundCloud and Bandcamp and those types of things, has been quite common practice in the industry for a long time, is that artists are now owning the rights to the master recordings and using that ownership of those copyrights as leverage to negotiate better deals in terms of the split of royalties that they get back from the generation from the sales of those recordings. So a whole host of interesting things going on in the industry in terms of contract and copyright that I need to try and get across and teach to students, who most of whom have aspirations to work in the industry. But what underpins now more than ever And it's always been a data management exercise. My early engagements with the music industry, I've had independent record labels and things like that in the past. I managed artists, and I can remember the days when you used to sign up to PRS, the Collection Society here in the UK. Similar versions will be ASCAP and BMI in the US, or STIM in Sweden, as an example. It was paper forms, and you still need to paper form for PRS because it's a contract that you need to sign. But all the other data that you do now is through digital portals, and there's been an explosion of new entrants into the publishing market, in particular, probably most demonstrated by Cobalt. And there's this battle now over there's two business models in the publishing industries, in particular, the acquisition of catalogue, as you've been seeing, as demonstrated by Universal buying Bob Dylan's catalogue and those types of things, and also the speed with which that catalogue, the uses of that catalogue, can be tracked and traced, the accuracy of the data for the use globally, and also the speed with which when the money can be collected and paid through to the rights holders and copyright owners. And so these two complementary, but also competing business models, and Cobalt stolen a march on everybody else with the speed of and efficiency of royalty payments, where some of the more established publishers, your Sonys, your Universals, and some of the bigger independents, and Hypnosis, interestingly, have gone for more catalog acquisition and building big manageable catalogs. But all of these things come with the management of data. Everything to do with tracking and registration of ISRC codes, as Andrew alluded to in his presentation, the matching of those codes and the matching of data and all those types of things. So this would become a key management issue now in the music industries. And so to a certain extent, data has become very much the commodity that is being managed as much as music, and arguably music is data. Data is all very well and good, but unless you're using it to extract value in some way, then there's a lot of untapped value, I think, across the industries, because the data is not being managed effectively. There's been because of the proprietary nature, there's a reluctance generally to move towards more open and transparent sharing of data. This book by a couple of scholars from Scandinavia last year, talking about the issues of trying to engage with Spotify to let them analyze some of their data. It was pretty open in the early 2000s. Some scholars in Scandinavia did research with WIMP, which eventually became Tidal, and looked at what are the hot topics of debate at the minute, which is the difference between the subscriber share model and the user share model of royalty distribution. But as the streaming platforms have got bigger and become more dominant in the industry, then they're much more reluctant now to obviously make their data available, which is a challenge for us when we're trying to teach aspiring music industry practitioners the importance of data and how to work with them. And to a certain extent, this is where MusicID has been a gift to us as educators, because it gives us data sets to work with to help them develop. And so this is what I've been trying to do for the last couple of years. I've known that there's been a demand to produce data savvy students for the past couple of years. But a couple of the challenges is I'm not particularly data savvy. I grew up in a an analog industry, and predominantly worked in an analog industry. And while I'm relatively data literate, I certainly haven't got, it's an entire new skill set, really. I see it, being able to, the data science side of things and those types of things. And so me having the time and my colleagues having the time to work, just understand what MusicID can be and do has taken a while. So I've skirted around the edges of using MusicID for a couple of years, and it's been used. I've used it to help some students with particular dissertation topics answer those questions. So the demise of the album has been a common topic over the last few years, and MusicID has been great for establishing actually that there was a demise, but it seems to have tapered off and stabilized now, certainly at the last analysis. The relationships between success of films at the box office and original soundtracks related to those films we've used MusicID for in the past, but just recently I've wanted to embed it much more in the curriculum, and so as of this year and as of this afternoon, to a certain extent, I've just started to use it on this contracts module, to get students to start to engage with these questions of catalog acquisition and those types of things. And there's loads of great questions out there that we can start to ask, where the data that MusicID supplies can act as a foundation to answering those questions. So this idea of, Phil Collins being cool again because in the air tonight has blown up on TikTok. So TikTok seems to be the driver of most of our sort of cultural conversation currently. And again, this being a sort of an economic analysis of him being in the wilderness for almost a decade and then having a return to glory. Just this morning, Hypnosis announced that they aim to raise another £150 million so they can buy, acquire more catalogue of songs. And so both of these instances, I can ask a question to the students of, is if you were, a share invested in shares, would Hypnosis demonstrate, looking at its catalogue, would it demonstrate a good investment to buy some shares in it? I wish I had done about 2 years ago. Or if the sort of this Phil Collins effect, this what they call an N-shaped sort of curve, is this just exclusive to Phil Collins, or can it be replicated across other artists? Who's got the best deal in terms of the acquisition of the catalogue, the Universal with Bob Dylan, or Hypnosis with Neil Young, or those types of questions? So there's a whole host of things that we can start to build into the program. That MusicID can be one element of helping students answer, but in doing so, it gets them to engage with data management and other problems that they're going to encounter, and in the way that they've got to make choices in selecting which data to look at, and devise their own methodologies so they can effectively compare one catalogue or one artist with another, and those types of things. So we're just in the very beginnings. This is a graph from one of my students today about Bruno Mars's single sales, and even just at a glance, this shows sort of interesting stuff. The early 2010s, where we're talking about formats. This is very much prime download era. Things chart right at the top and then sort of drop quite considerably, and then you see a much more sort of streaming based sales pattern as things move along. And again, interestingly, I thought Bruno Mars had released a lot more music in the latter part of the last decade than he had, and obviously that is Uptown Funk in there. So even just simple things, and that's where we are at the minute, with just getting the students familiar with the platform, getting them to use, look at the graphs and see what that tells, and then put some contextual underpinning to explaining the things that they're seeing in the data. My aim is to get them to the point where Andrew, the types of experiments and analysis Andrew's doing. And so over time, over the next year or two, as I slowly get to more familiar with the platform and what it's capable of, and the students probably end up teaching me an awful lot of the things when they play with the platform a lot more. I hope that this will become a way of preparing students better for the industry. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, I'll rejoin the world to help with the Q&A. Thanks so much for that. You turned out exactly on time, like almost to the second, so I'm very impressed.
It's my day job, so.
Yeah. Yeah, especially lecturing, you have to be very careful with time management. Let's see. I will chatter for just a moment to wait to see if we have any questions, to let anyone type those in. It always takes a moment here in the digital format. So I'm so thrilled and just intrigued with how these presentations have all come together. The way yours is tied in some ways with Andrew's, and both of you have talked about topics that I want to touch on, just kind of superficially in mine. I'm especially interested in your dissertation students project about, well, both of them, but the relationship between the soundtracks and the OST recordings, because that's kind of something that I've been looking at, just not even really for research, just curious, because something that I'll be talking about is how prevalent cast recordings for musicals were, movie cast recordings, and also just film soundtracks like Dr. Zhivago were in the 60s. I feel that's probably true for every decade, but I guess musicals in so many ways were like the original pop music. So like they're a huge force in the music industry from a very early time.
Yeah, I think that's. I'm trying to recall but certainly The Greatest Showman was one of the sort of aspects of the study and how long that stayed, around as a soundtrack in the charts for an extremely long time and outlived the film. Another example would be A Star Is Born, and Lady Gaga's renaissance as an artist and sort of reimagining as an artist, and how that soundtrack has done, arguably, well, certainly as well as the film, and in lots of ways she used it as a catalyst to sort of reposition her career. And so those types of things are really interesting. But it was looking at this sort of relationship between the for how long the film was in the box office and those types of things, and how long the sort of, and certainly The Greatest Showman was its music endured even much longer than the sort of the film was sort of available in the cinemas.
Yeah, and that seems to have always been the case. I know for Greatest Showman, I think that was it the #1 album of the year?
Yeah,
in the US, I think it was. Yeah, so it's always incredible how it's just these things have such a universal reach, I suppose, between parents and kids both. And also anytime there's a tie-in for multimedia, for film or for television, that certainly has an impact. And with A Star Is Born, I've been looking at streaming charts a lot lately, and mostly I was just kind of looking at Eurovision stuff because I had Eurovision fever this year after being stuck indoors with no glamour, I think. So I used to always watch it casually, but this year I got just like super sucked in, and I was looking at all the streaming charts for all the different countries. And intriguingly, as so many things for Lady Gaga, specifically from A Star Is Born, are still in a lot of the social media and streaming charts.
Yeah, it's sort of, I think it's, I think you can check this on MusicID, but I think it's her second most successful album now, if you look at in terms of sales data already. And if you compare that to how long the Fame has been out, I think it's almost reached half the sales of Fame, which has been around for 13 years now, probably, I think. And obviously in a streaming era as well, where sort of, you have to get a much more sort of, the Fame was released in the unit model, probably at the height of digital downloads, and so a different economic model to the one that A Star Is Born has been released in. And so that's interesting to see as well, how much revenue it's generated in such a short period of time.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of presence from that in the singles charts, and of course in the albums chart too, but the longevity that I've noticed just casually, so I could be wrong about this, has been in the singles. I forgot what I was going to say, so let me move on to our first question. We got one. So from Frugina Mortz, she asked, how can you build in this sort of data knowledge and education into the curriculum in an exciting way? I mean, the pedagogy perspective, and what are your teaching techniques?
At the minute, I'm figuring it out as I go, to be honest. I'm sort of opening up the platform to the students, where obviously MusicID have supplied us with some initial instructional videos and those types of things. And then really, what I'm doing is giving the students weekly tasks. So the Bruno Mars, basically what I asked them to do this week was just choose a couple of artists that they like from the 2010s and just go and put their names into the various different modules on MusicID and see what they find out, and then bring them to the seminars and present them. And then we just started to then talk about, okay, so why are we seeing this, like I did at the end of the presentation, why are we seeing this pattern? What is it? What is this telling us? So again, even that sort of notion of, a very isolated release for Bruno Mars sort of confounded certainly my perception of how much presence Bruno Mars has had in the market in the last few years. So it's that, then that will evolve into a set of initially essay questions based around this sort of catalog acquisition thing that's going on in the industry at the minute, and the new entrants into the market. And so the students for that task will have to use MusicID as one component to analyze what's going on, who's got the best deal or those types of things. So really at the beginning, just as I'm learning how to use it and learning how to assess it, I'm going to keep it relatively light and simple at this stage. I've got some colleagues within the department, once I've embedded it in, who are much more data science savvy and analytically savvy than I am. And then we'll start to look to do some things that are a bit more challenging, and sort of work towards the type of research that Andrew presented. But I sort of see that as probably about sort of 12 months away from being in that position. And it's going to take us a bit of time to step back from it and start to have a play with it ourselves as a staff team. So that's how I'm doing it at the minute. It's really sort of it's more, in lots of ways, it's still very narrative based. It's looking at the visualizations and the presentations of the data, and then seeing what narratives they tell, and then looking at how we're going to make sense of those things. So it shows trends. The transition from downloads to streaming within that 10-year gap of delivery chose the 2010s for that reason, because it'll show different sort of sale patterns and patterns of use.
Okay, great. And we've got one more question to finish up.
Yeah.
So someone would like to know about, this is a really great question.
Yeah.
So what kind of data competency and prerequisites do your students need? So to join these programs or to start doing this kind of data work as in your course, do you need to have prerequisites with data or analytics, like in statistics or using Excel?
No, is the straight answer. Not yet. No, again, it's pretty broad and generic, as I've just explained. Some students come with those skill sets already, but and obviously most students, when you get to master's level, have done some sort of statistics modules at undergraduate level or those types of things. Or there's just general support modules that they can take online within our university, where they can go and learn about statistics and those types of things. We do an awful lot of team working and group working. And again, Andrew's example, you put a team of students together to work on a particular project, then they'll bring various skills to the project. But yeah, it's a bit more sort of probing and seeing how it works at the minute than anything where I want to sort of limit people access. Just them knowing about data and how to use it is the main thing. And ultimately for me, the main thing is how it eventually the insights that they generate inform decision making in the real world, because really, certainly Spotify and many of the record labels now are using, as Andrew talked about before, are using much more probabilistic models to inform their actual strategic decision making than the music industries has used previously. So again, it's just to get them used to those processes and those ideas more than I'm looking for any sort of specific statistical detail to be developed.
And I'll add on to that, was if your students going out into the real world, what, for this program at least, what does the real world look like? What kind of jobs are they preparing for? Because they can't all be labeled executives. So what are some of the positions that they're hoping to use this data in? Yeah.
And again, it's a shift in the industry focus. I think the data entry sort of element of many industry roles is sort of the lowest level in the companies, and it's the thing that companies have not really given much credence to in the past. But obviously, as tech management styles continually become more adapted and adopted within music industry structures and particularly record companies and publishing companies, we're seeing the importance of data go in the sort of hierarchy of decision making go more and more up the to the top of the list. And so increasingly the industry is going to expect students to come in with some sort of baseline knowledge of data and how it works and how to use it and how to manipulate it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So we're out of time now for Matt. We have 5 minutes left in the hour. So I will send Matt away into the ether here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that. It's so interesting to see how these courses are developing, and because what I've heard from a number of industry people that I'm not an industry person, so I don't know a lot about this, and I've just seen sort of picking these up from our colleagues, such as Matt, and attending conferences and listening. And even though it feels like we're so many years, we're decades now into the digital age, so much of the industry and from the production end, the consumption end across the board is so much in flux. So it's just really fascinating to see how the industry itself is kind of struggling to adapt or continually adapting. It's let me transition. So I've got 5 minutes. So I have just a very small, superficial kind of presentation prepared. So I'll fill the last 5 minutes with that, just to give you, as a segue into the workshop portion. So don't everyone leave just yet. So after I talk, I'll just give a couple of concluding notes and then get us going into the workshop for those of you who are going to stay on and follow along with that, or just watch, whatever works for you. Oops. So again, as a musicologist, I've been using MusicID now for 2 years. Some of it for my own research, some of it for just projects that we're doing, instructive, trying to help teach. I'm trying to help teach Matt students how to use the system just on a technical basis. And Matt's doing all the hard work of teaching them how to actually read the data. But especially for musicologists, we're not always used to looking at record charts unless you're just trying to look at, it kind of sometimes it seems like trivia even in popular music studies. But as I've discovered, is that there's always something new to learn. So I'm going to walk you through just a few of the little things that I have found through using it. But truly, every single time that I use this, like one of the examples that I have here today, I just discovered yesterday. Every single time that I use the system or talk to someone about it, I just find some interesting point of information that is a lead to something that could be an interesting discovery, an interesting point that can fit into a project that I'm working on. Sometimes it's just something curious that I will never do anything with, but I can file it away for later. But through looking at the data, record data in general, but specifically actually in the MusicID system. And again, I mean this sincerely, I'm not being paid to say this. It's the way that the data is laid out in the platform and the way that the visualizations are generated, the graph, for me as a visual person, it really helps me access the information in a way that I wasn't getting just from looking at the record charts. And I'll show you actually here, this mess is kind of how I was working before MusicID. So I was doing some things on the 60s for a dissertation chapter, and I was looking at year-end charts, just looking at songs and albums, but I wanted specific countries of the year-end charts, not just worldwide success, who had the #1 song, but in the UK primarily, but also in the US as a point of comparison. So I was just going through back issues of magazines, random kind of dubious websites online, Wikipedia, the publisher websites, all kinds of things, just trying to pull together this data. And I have it all pasted into here. Oops, let me go back. Sorry. It's color-coded because I color-code everything, but so don't mind the colors, but I just have millions of columns for all of the different conflicting information. Especially for the 60s, the charts are a little bit odd because they were not, especially for the UK, they weren't yet centralized. The official charts company didn't start until, I want to say 1970, that area at least within a year or two. So what official charts company at the beginning of the 70s was take all of these half dozen magazines and other trade resources from the 60s, and they sort of collated and standardized them. So I've got various things here, and you can see it's a mess. It was this took me hours to do. It was an enormous nightmare to try to go through all of these conflicting sources. You don't know if they're accurate. I had to look up scans of magazines and try to see how they were working. So it's kind of a nightmare. So then when I was introduced to MusicID, I'm able to find some of these things in a reliable way, which I know I've gone through dozens of records, cross-referencing them against the publishers, against the magazines, to make sure that things are accurate, and that it is. So this has saved me a ton of time. But just as a couple of quick examples, I'll show you something that I found when looking. So this is an example of how I was looking at information for a completely unrelated project. My work for my dissertation is about medieval references in popular music, but just looking at record charts and year-end charts to get an idea of influence. I was using them to see who were the most prevalent artists that year, where were they prevalent, just to kind of make cases for influence, who, especially for maybe some of the indie artists, who were they listening to, who can I make a case for, was in the orbit of a social circle, or just something that someone would have known, even if they're in the sticks and don't know anybody. But I found some of these just interesting bits that led me off to this tangent that I did as a small case study for MusicID, which some of you may have seen because we have it as a short video. But I was looking at Beatles versus the musicals. And when you're looking at year-end charts and editorial charts, what you see over and over is that the Beatles, of course, are always #1, but there's something missing, because when you're looking at singles charts, there are no album cuts. So even if a song got a ton of radio play, it wouldn't appear on the singles charts because that wasn't included in the calculation. It had to be released as a unit of sale, as a single, to be counted even as a radio play. That was a separate chart for catalog. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the chart now. It's catalog albums and, sorry, it's on the tip of my tongue. So when you're looking at some of the enormous success of something like The Sound of Music or West Side Story, you don't see singles on the singles chart. What you do see is that in the records charts, which I will show here. So this pink line is the Dr. Zhivago soundtrack. I found this just accidentally by looking at some Beatles albums, see what was around them. And in the previous slide, if you're looking at the day that Sgt. Pepper went into the charts, these are these other things, these are other top 2 albums. At the time, Sgt. Pepper, this gray line here, I hope you can see my mouse cursor, it actually opened at number 9, I think, in the US. So this is the Billboard Top 200. And then it went up to #1, of course, and stayed there for a long time. So this is against the other top two albums that were out at the time, which are the Monkees and Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, which is a, sorry, I'm having the names of things are escaping me. I'm terrible at names. So you can see Sgt. Pepper is huge. We all know the Beatles are successful, but when you're looking at the artist names, specifically, I was scrolling down the table of data, and you notice the soundtrack here. Unlike the other things, this had 146 weeks in the chart, which is, multiple times more than any of these other things that were top albums of the year. But when you're looking at rankings of top artists, they don't appear because they're various artists, they're compilations. So they don't appear in list of artists. So I added Dr. Zhivago here to my graph, and then I see how it compares in the sales pattern to the other top albums. So you can see the start lines are when they were released, or sorry, when they entered the chart, which is usually about 2 to 4 weeks after it was released at this time. And you can see that it started out way low, but something happened to make it go to the top and stay at the top. So my conclusion for this small project was that sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. The conclusion was that, and looking at the chart data, you can find some things that are listed, that are excluded from some of the conventional wisdom and conventional editorials. And of course, this is just one little point of data. It doesn't tell you why it was successful, why musicals or soundtracks were so popular. In some cases, you might hypothesize that the album sales were so high because there were no singles, so there's no other way to obtain this music. And I think also the broad appeal. So albums are a lot more expensive than singles, so that can tell us possibly that more adults were shopping, whether for themselves or for their families. And very briefly, I'll show you just one other thing that I found in the 60s charts. So looking at the year-end charts, I'm sure some of you are aware of the creation of album culture over the 60s. So the first half of the 60s, going from the 50s, is very song-based, as we talked about before. The industry is very singles-driven. When albums are released, as you can see in early Beach Boys albums, early Beatles albums, they're really just collections of songs. It's not considered a cohesive album the way even today people still tend to put together albums, although the collection of singles is making a comeback thanks to the digital format. But then in the mid-60s, because of some of the cultural changes, the album begins to shift, and you can see the split between singles culture and album culture in the chart. So if we look here, the #1 album of 1962 for the US and the UK, both was West Side Story, the original movie soundtrack. In 1969, it was Inagata-Davida by Iron Butterfly for the US and Abbey Road for the UK. The singles show you some of the divide, because here we have bubblegum pop pretty much across the board. 1963, the #1 song for the US is Sugar Shack by Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs, and I Remember You by Frank Ifield or Ifield in the UK. And then at the end of the decade, 1969, Sugar Sugar by the Archies was the #1 single of the year for both songs. So interestingly, that's the only #1 single by a fictional band. And that's interesting to me because the Archies is a very American comic, and it was at this time, of course, the Archies were a cartoon. So it's interesting to me that it was so popular in the UK. And as a little footnote here I have, the #2 song for the US in 1969 was Age of Aquarius, Let the Sun Shine, which I love because it's a great fusion of the two cultures. You have, it's from a musical, from Hairspray, but it's also this really wonderful, I mean, you've all heard it, you know, a long kind of psychedelic funk, very new agey song. So it's a really great, and it's a long song too. I think there's a longer version than a single edit, but it's a really great fusion of the two kind of cultures coming together there, the musicals and the new hippie stuff. And my favorite example being the Iron Butterfly, In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. As I'm sure a lot of you are aware, the song is famously excessive. It's 17 minutes long. 2.5 minutes of it are a drum solo, and it's followed immediately by a 3-minute organ solo. So shockingly, the song was released as a 2-minute and 52-second single edit, which actually did pretty well in the US. It peaked at number 30, but the sales, as life in the chart, as you can see, MusicID, is so much shorter compared to the album, which of course was the #1 album of the year. So even though it was available as a single, presumably to help out all the kids who couldn't afford the album, it seems that there was a clear preference for the long version. So these are simply some interesting points that you can look at. Oops, sorry, I hit escape prematurely, but I will move on. Okay, we have one question from Roger, who is our fearless CEO. And I will get to his question as we move on to the workshop part. So I run slightly over, but let me bring back, I'll bring back Matt and Andrew just to say goodbye, unless they're going to stay on, and then we'll move into the workshop. I'll make sure you all are set up with the login and all that. So we'll have just a minute to get set up. Right, and so any Q&A that anyone has for me will handle in the workshop part. Like I said, this is just a preview of kind of some of the things we'll be looking at in the workshop. So for those of you who are staying, if you can log into the system, that would be great. And I'll bring up the slides to help you get into that. You should have received an email. If you're unable, of course, I know it's challenging on a virtual platform when you're already using your computer to watch the workshop, but we are recording this so we can make it available to you after the fact. If it would be helpful for you to just go through it on your own pace at a later time. The login information that we've given to all of you is valid through July 1st, so you'll have plenty of time to play with the system. Okay, so take a moment to get some water if you need. I will put up the slide to give you a chance to log in, and then we'll get started with the workshop. And let me just send off Matt and Andrew. Thank you so much for attending and for helping us out and giving these wonderful presentations. We're all, I know, very excited to see where this leads you and where it leads your students to.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great job, Matt.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'll have to get in touch with you, Andrew, and talk about your research in a bit more detail.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the purpose of some of this event too, is for networking. Oh, which I'll bring back. All right, so you guys can leave or just turn yourselves off, whatever you'd like to do. If you want to watch,
Thanks very much, Katie.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome to stay and help out with things if you want. But you've had a long day. I'm sure you want to get on with your life. Oops, sorry, I keep clicking the wrong button. So
thanks very much. See you soon. Bye.